Hi everyone, it's Cam here for howtodigitalpaint.com, and in this video I'll be explaining some common terminology used in digital painting. Since there's heaps to cover, I'll try to be as concise as possible. So first of all, DPI. DPI refers to dots per inch. Dots are basically pixels. Standard print resolution is 300 DPI. And standard screen resolution is 72 dpi. Cmyk, Rgb, and Greyscale refer to different color modes. Cmyk is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and that's a reference to the ink colors used for printing. Rgb refers to red, green, and blue, and that's the way that monitors display color. And Greyscale refers to shades of grey, black and white. Value refers to the shades of grey. So this image is just values in Greyscale, and you still get a pretty good sense of the form, the details, and materials. So you can see this image is just values, and then this is the same image with color. So generally, if your values are right, your colors are going to turn out pretty well too. Hue refers to the color of a color. This face is made up of different hues, but they're all the same saturation and brightness. So if we desaturate the image, you'll see it's just all grey. Same here, these are all same hue, saturation, and brightness, just different colors. And that can be adjusted in the color slider. Monochromatic is kind of Greyscale, but then it has a shade of one color. So mono meaning one and chroma meaning color. Saturation refers to how intense or grey a color is. Colors on the opposite ends of a spectrum will desaturate and neutralize and become more grey. So you can see this orange is more intense and the blue is intense also. But as they mix, since they are complementary at opposite ends of the color wheel, they begin to neutralize. And that's the saturation slider. It's the letter S in Photoshop. You can see in the color picker, letter S. This is an image, it's a very saturated image of me on a sunny day. So you can see these very saturated areas, and then these less saturated areas in the shadows, especially because it's mixing with the blue of the sky. Saturation can be used to create a focal area. I'll talk about focal area later. You can see in this image, very saturated area really catches the eye. Again, the blue is neutralizing the yellower area, and as the two mix we get much less saturated area. Same sort of thing happening there. And you'll notice in this image, as we move further from the light is being 100% brightness, 0 saturation. But then as the light falls off on the skin, it gets more saturated. But be aware that in areas where there's very little or no light, it's going to be no saturation. Color temperature, that refers to how warm or cool a color is. So this is an example of a cool image. very blue. This image is a warm image, very warm, especially that there's this candlelight illuminating the face. This is an image where we see a play of warm and cool. So the cool area of this wall is being affected by it's picking up the blue of the sky, and then this area is being lit by the sun, so it's getting that very warm orange. And then to make that more noticeable, more saturated, it's very orange and very blue here. Same idea here, playing up those warm and cool relationships, so the shadows being cooler and the highlights being more red and warm. You'll notice color temperature can be perceived by those kind of fading out. So if we look at this image, the hottest area is very white and then it fades out along. And here, these are color samples taken from the neon lights. So as the light fades out, it becomes more saturated. But then the areas where there's no light at all are desaturated. Now looking at edges. Edges are the way that you treat, as the name suggests, the different edges of things. Generally, things that are in light are going to have a harder edge, whereas things in shadow are going to have a softer edge. Also, things in the distance are generally more soft, and things in the foreground or areas of focus are harder edges. So just have a look at some quick examples. This is one by Coro. So the area of highlight is given very hard edge, and then areas where it's more in shadow, they soften out. And very noticeable in the eyes there. There's an image by John Singer Sargent. Areas where light is hitting have a harder edge. Areas of shadow have been softened. Let's have a look at form. Form is how we understand the three-dimensionality of an object. So statues, looking at statues is a good example. And form can be described by hue shifts and also value shifts. So if we have a look at this cast here, we'll notice that we can understand the three-dimensionality of this by the different value shifts. So as the form turns, the value changes also. Planes refer to a simplified forms, I suppose. So we have these different planes, and we understand the form and the angle of them by the value that they are. Texture refers to the material quality. It can often be rough or a smooth texture. It can also refer to texture brushes within Photoshop. So we can add texture in the brush settings. So this is a textured brush, and you can see it has a bit of a painterly quality to it. And you can have softer brush. So that's also going back to edges. So you can play up hard and soft edges and areas of detail or less detail. Materials are different ways that we perceive what an object is made out of. So it might be fruit, so it's made out of, you know, the skin of the fruit and the different elements to make up that. And then a spoon is made out of metal, so it's gonna have different qualities of how it reflects light, how it absorbs or reflects color, and also how it scatters light as the light hits it. So I'll give you a practical example of that. So this would be a smooth object. So as light hits it, it just bounces. Usually bounces out at the same angle that it hits it. So that's a smooth object, and would get probably a very bright specular at this point. This object being very rough, light would hit it and would scatter out in all different directions. So that would create a diffuse light. And this last material being transparent, if you could consider it like skin, would get the subsurface scattering effect. So what's happening with that is, if it has blood within it, say this is a finger, as the light enters, it'll go through, it'll illuminate this area, but then it'll also penetrate and bounce light around all over the place. So that'll give it like a red glow. So it's adding color together there. If you want to study materials, I suggest to do still life, such as this one that I showed you, and include a variety of objects. And you can study photos also, so you can see this is a good example of a mixture of materials, and you get a good sense of what they actually are by the way the values are represented and the way light and things are affected as you perceive them. So he's got this metal here, leather on his sleeve, some sort of fur, and leather boots. This is actually gaffer tape on the hammer. So that's something you can research and study and be able to make your digital paintings more believable as you understand those better. A focal area is an area of most importance within your image. So when your viewer looks at your work, you want them to have something they can rest their eye on, and also to understand what they should be looking at within the image. So the focal point here in this still life is the spout of the pot, and the focal point is being created by the fact that there's more contrast and sharpness in this area and specular highlights, and it actually fades out and becomes more blurry in this area. Focal point here is the fact that this guy is in the light, these people are receding into more shadow, And with this image, focal point is being created a number of ways by the contrast of the boy's white shirt against the black, the fading out of the detail, and also that they're all looking at this direction. So that's something you can research more and incorporate into your work. Perspective is how we perceive space and depth within an image. So we can construct perspective using perspective grids. And we can see in this image that parallel lines are converging to a single point along the horizon, and that's known as the vanishing point. So there's much info out there on perspective, and it's very foundational in your work, and you want to have a good understanding of that. Again, on perspective, we're talking in relation to depth here. This is atmospheric perspective, so we get a sense of distance by the fact that as things recede into the background, they become bluer and lighter and less contrasted. And it can also be suggested by the fact that there's more detail in the foreground. There's these leading lines by the road along the valley here. There's more saturation perhaps here, and less saturation, or just that contrast of colors there. And this image, probably a more extreme example, by the smoke effects that are happening. It's creating a lot of atmosphere, and this is really becoming light and less contrasted here. It's much more saturation in the foreground, more contrast, more detail, and all that recedes as it goes into the background. So that will create depth in your work. Custom brushes are simply brushes that are created in Photoshop, customized by the user, and can be shared with other people. So you can create a whole list of modifications and tweaks to your brushes in order to get the appearance that you're looking for. So this is some marks that different custom brushes can make, and it's really infinite what you can come up with. So you can see there's also specific brushes, one that's made for this chain or these more painterly marks. And if you want to make a custom brush, just make a new layer. It can be in a new document. Just make the mark that you're looking for, and this will be the kind of brush tip. And then you can select, make a selection, and then edit, define brush preset. And that'll become a brush preset, and then you can modify it. And then once you're done, go to edit, new brush preset. There's a lot of good information out there on that. I even have some videos on how to digital paint you can look at. Opacity and flow. Opacity is referring to how transparent or opaque the pixels are, and flow adjusts how transparent how much pigment is released at a time. So I'll just give a demonstration of that. So transparency might be you just change the opacity in the layer, but you can also change it up here in the toolbar for the brush. And most digital artists, they set the flow and opacity control to pen pressure. So if we have a look, we can go to transfer, also known as other dynamics in previous versions of Photoshop, and you can set that to pen pressure for the flow jitter, or the flow control and opacity control. So what that means is that how hard I press with the brush, or with the stylus, I'm going to get less or more opacity and flow. and you can't get that with the mouse, but you can manually adjust it. But if you're doing digital painting, get a tablet. Layers are, as the name suggests, layers. So if you think about an onion, as you peel an onion, you're going to have those different layers, and those all combine and can be stacked in different ways. So you've got your layers palette, and that creates a hierarchy of how they appear, and you can group layers and things like that. So I'll just show you. I've got some different layers here, and I can move them in between each other, or I can resize them. I can edit them independently of each other, and that's how you're going to work digitally. You're going to use layers. You can't just use one layer, but it helps to use layers since you can make changes easily, and also you lose that fear, because anything new you want to add on and add to your image, you can do it on a new layer, and then if it works or doesn't work, you can delete it or drop it down. So the higher the layer is in the stack, that means it'll appear in front of the other. Okay, now onto masks. Masks are a good way of kind of erasing out pixels, but you can and then it's more forgiving because you can go back and actually make changes to it. So to create a mask, you click the little icon here. It's a rectangle with a circle in it, and I've already created a mask and painted into it. So you want to make sure when you're working with masks that you have the mask thumbnail selected in the layers palette. So you'll notice if I paint with white here, it's revealing the areas that I hid with the mask, and then if I paint with with black, it's hiding areas once again. And if I paint with grey, it's actually like a it's kind of an in-between, adjusting the transparency of it. And in the layers menu, you can actually make further modifications to it. Now the jitter is just it's a brush setting. So we can have a look at some brushes that use that setting. So if we go in to here, to the brush menu, you'll see you've got all these color dynamics, hue, shift, saturation, jitter. You can see as I paint, it's changing the colors with each little mark that it's making. So that's something you can play with. And if you keep it very subtle, it can really generate a bit more variation in your work and give it a more traditional feel. So this has a bit of jitter happening as well. It's very subtle, but still creates a bit of texture and nice variation. Studies are pretty important for your improvement, and the number one rule of studies is apply what you study, because otherwise a lot of the things that you study you'll forget. So you want to apply what you learn. So these are some studies I've done in the past. You can study from photos and screenshots of movies. and you can do studies of other painters that you like. You may often hear the term washed out. Somebody might say to you, oh, your image looks very washed out. And this is usually because you may have used the dodge tool, which seems to suck all the color out of your work. So this is a very old image I did back in 2007, one of my first digital paintings. And I think I really liked it at the time, but it does have that washed out look. You know, there's no color in the highlight here, and it just looks really dull and depressing. So that's an example of a washed out image. You may hear the term blending also used a lot in digital painting, and that's just referring to blending colors together. So you can have two different colors on the palette, lay down one, lay down another on top of the other, and because you're painting with the transparency, you're getting a mixture of the two colors as they overlay each other. So then you can blend them together. And you can use the technique to smooth out your work. And what I'm doing is I'm holding down the Alt key while I have the brush tool selected, and I can color pick straight off the canvas. So I can pick that in between color and begin to mix it together. Blending will be easier if you're using softer brushes, but you can still do it with a hard edge. Depending on how you want the edges to appear. Okay, now we're going into lighting now. So firstly we'll look at what specular highlights are. Specular highlights are the brightest point of a highlight, areas where the light is hitting. So you can see here there's these specular highlights, which are these hints of white or accents of white along this glass here. Here's another image with some specular highlights. So specular highlights can really convey what material an image, object is by the way that it's reflecting light. You can tell this has a smooth surface since the specular highlights are quite large. If this was a rough surface, those specular highlights would be very broken up and you probably wouldn't be able to see them. And this is a very poor use of specular highlights, going back to one of my very old images, and this is how not to use specular highlights. You can see he's got this like really bulbous sort of bicep here, and I don't know what I was thinking. I thought it was good at the time, I think, but I was really struggling with it. It's a really old image. But you'll often hear the old thing that people say, oh, your work looks really amateur, you know, you got specular highlights everywhere, and yeah. So this is one example of bad use of that. Okay, now bounce light and reflected light. This is, I think I explained a bit about it just back with materials, but you can see here that the light is bouncing, shining into the window and bouncing off these different objects and filling up areas. So You can see here, as the light comes in, it's bouncing, and then it's lighting up this area, lighting up here and around here. So everything is becoming really illuminated as the light scatters, and it's finding its way everywhere. Here's another example of bounce light. So the light was had a very strong light, and it was hitting my red jumper and bouncing up into here. So it's also carrying the color and illuminating areas like the underside of the nose and here. And you can see another example of that. The light is hitting his nose and his cheek and illuminating this shadowed area around his eye. Ambient light is usually referring to the main light of the environment. So it's the secondary light to, so if you're outdoors, the primary light would be the sun, and the ambient light would be the sky, because this as the sun goes through the sky, there's different particles within the sky that are catching light and scattering it all over the place. So you can see in this image that areas that are facing the sky are picking up the color of the sky. This armor is becoming very blue, and then the primary light is this skylight, and it's very white there. So another example of that is this is a photo of me. I'm indoors, but it's not really the sunlight, it's just the ambient light coming in through the window. So it's very blue light there. And usually ambient light will cool down the shadows. So going back to this image, although this is in shadow, it's creating a very cool area by that. Okay, using the same image, we're looking at rim lighting. Rim lighting is this kind of edge that is created by light. Here's another example. You got this kind of outline of light around the edge there, and again there. So that's an effective one that you can use to make your image more dramatic. Now looking at the core and Terminator shadow. So it's not really the core shadow, it's actually the core of the shadow. So a lot of people get them mixed up and they'll call the Terminator shadow the core shadow, which isn't really correct. So I'll just explain what the difference is. So if we look at this image, you'll see that there's this halfway point between the light and the shadow, and this creates this very dark area here. So the core of the shadow in this image would be this area, and then the Terminator shadow is this whole area here. So the core being the center of the shadow, and then Terminator shadow being the part where the light terminates, and that makes it darker. And the contrast is usually accentuated by bounce light, and in this case there's a pretty strong bounce light as the light bounces off her shoulder, hitting her clothing and bouncing up into here. You'll notice a lot with plastic casts as well. So the core of the shadow being this part, but the Terminator shadow is this whole area. You might often hear the term that something looks amateurish, and well, people try to figure out why their work looks amateur. And I can show you some examples of my earlier work that will give some ideas. I guess the most simple way to say why a work looks amateurish is just ignoring all the fundamentals, or just not really understanding how to use them properly. So if you look at these images, this is one of the first digital paintings I did. I think I did it with the mouse. Like I didn't know how to use custom brushes properly. This area is heaps saturated, even though it's going into the distance. There's texture down here for some reason. Yeah, there's just so many things wrong with it. All the values are completely off. Yeah, there's only bad things I can say about it. This is a piece done with a mouse. I didn't know how to use the smudge tool properly, so I kind of tried to cheat with it, and I've got all this weird stuff happening here. Just terrible anatomy. There's no proper form. There's no proper value to describe the form. There's no saturation on the edge of like where the light is hitting. Terrible anatomy, just weird looking hands, and there's just amateur. This one I thought was kind of good at the time, but I was really struggling with it and trying to figure out what was wrong. I don't know why this guy's hand is glowing so much. So there's big glowing red finger and thumb. So that seems weird. This is very washed out in the highlight here. The material doesn't look like what it should be. That the highlight shouldn't be that strong if he's wearing cloth. Yeah, bad use of custom brushes once again. All the values, colors, everything's wrong about it. Pretty bad anatomy too. So those are things that are going to make work look amateur. But to not make it look amateur, just get all the fundamentals in there. So for a good tutorial that covers more of this information, check out www.itchstudios.com/art_tut.htm. And this was a very good tutorial I found early on, and really opened up my eyes to the fundamentals of digital painting and art in general. And for more videos and more tutorials about digital painting, check out my website, howtodigitalpaint.com. Hope this lesson hasn't been too long. I've tried to be thorough but concise, but there's just so much to cover and feel like I still left a lot out. But hope you learned heaps, and look forward to the next video. Thanks for watching.